Well, good morning, and I hope this finds you well. We're at the start of a very special fortnight in the life of our church as we remember the most special week in Jesus' life. And it starts with Jesus celebrating the festival of unleavened bread, known as Passover, as Luke describes it. Our reading is from Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, beginning at verse 1. The time came for the festival of unleavened bread known as Passover. The chief priests and the scribes looked for a way to assassinate Jesus, a difficult task because of the crowds. The Satan entered into Judas, whose surname was Iscariot, who was one of the company of the 12. He went and held a meeting with the chief priests and officers to discuss how he might hand Jesus over. They were delighted and promised to pay him. He agreed and started to look for an opportunity to hand him over to them when the crowds weren't around. The day of unleavened bread arrived, the day when people had to kill the Passover lamb. Jesus dispatched Peter and John. "Off you go," he said, "and get the Passover ready for us to eat." "Where do you want us to prepare it?" they asked him. "Listen carefully," said Jesus. "As you go into the city, a man will meet you carrying a jar of water. Follow him, and when he goes into a house, go after him. Then say to the householder there, 'The teacher says, where is the living room where I can eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a large upstairs room laid out and ready. Make the preparations there." So they went and found it as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. It's crucial to our understanding of this passage to know what Passover was and what it meant to the Jews. It's named after the time when the Hebrews were in Egypt as slaves and were being particularly badly treated. Moses and Aaron had tried negotiating with Pharaoh, and God had sent plagues, but none of them had persuaded Pharaoh to actually let the Hebrews go free. The final plague was the death of the firstborn son in families across Egypt. That is, except for those houses where there was blood from a sacrificed lamb smeared over the lintel above the door. The angel of death then knew to pass over those particular places. And the Hebrews needed to be ready to leave immediately, which meant that they couldn't actually make their bread so that it would rise in time. So they took unleavened bread with them, hence the festival of unleavened bread. So each year the Jews would celebrate the festival with a special meal which reminded them of the events of this particular time. Hopefully next year we will be able to celebrate a Passover meal at St. Bart's as we've done at St. Anne's over several years on Maunday Thursday. It's a special meal and an opportunity to understand the meaning of those words from the Old Testament and what happened then. Now back to our reading. Peter and John were told by Jesus to go and prepare the Passover. And yet the strange thing was that it was mostly prepared for them already. Peter and John were from Galilee, of course, so they didn't know Jerusalem particularly well. They were from the countryside. It's a bit like going up to London only a few times in your life and suddenly being expected to find something in London. That's quite tricky if you don't know the place well. So they asked where to go. And Jerusalem was packed, absolutely packed at this time of the year. Josephus, writing about 30 years or so after these times, was talking about 2.5 million people being in Jerusalem for the Passover. So that there were literally millions of people from all over the known world. And they were all trying to do the same thing. They were all trying to find a room to be able to celebrate the Passover. So not many rooms would be available at this very late stage. And Peter and John are told to look out for a man carrying a jar of water. Now that would really stand out, because it was the women who carried the jars of water. If a man was carrying water, he'd be carrying it in a wineskin, in a water skin. The room would be furnished, literally in the translation, spread, meaning that couches, because obviously when you ate meals in those days, then you would recline on one elbow. So you wouldn't be sat up at a table, you wouldn't be sat on a chair, you'd be lying down with one elbow at the table. And the couches that were there would be spread over with cloths of one sort or another. So all of that was there. And all that was left for Peter and John to do was to go and gather the food, obviously quite critical, and also the other ingredients, the bitter herbs and those sorts of things, the glasses for the wine, and then to lay it all out. Now, the judgment hangs over Israel and Jerusalem, as Jesus had so often spoken about, and Jesus is going to deliver his people by taking its force upon himself. He will provide the means of escape. But escape from what? From the powers of evil, as Luke describes it. But as God's plan for salvation reaches its climax, so the forces of evil do their best to thwart it. Up to this point, Jesus' main opponents have been the Pharisees, but now those with political power take over. The chief priests, they're seeking the opportunity to arrest Jesus at a time when no crowds are around. So to avoid that happening before he was ready, Jesus made a secret plan for the Passover meal. And the Satan is using Judas for a purpose, to accuse Jesus of being a false Messiah, of being a rebel, of being a liar. But Luke tells us in lots of ways, all the way through his gospel, that Jesus is completely innocent of all charges against him. So just as God had taken arrogant Pharaoh in Egypt and made his opposition serve God's purposes in that spectacular rescue of his people through the Red Sea and all of that, so now, through one man at supper with his friends, God does the same thing for everybody. The powers that rage against Pharaoh and his army, pursuing the Hebrews after the Passover, had been defeated. The rescue is secure. Our rescue is secure. That's the wonderful news about this. So what is it that we can take particularly from this passage? Well, first, that Jesus put plans in place so that he would die at his time and not at the timing of his opponents. God's timing is always right. Sometimes we just don't see it. We wish that it was sooner, or sometimes we wish it was later. But it is always right. It's always perfect. And it's worth sometimes reminding ourselves of that. And then Jesus said, off you go and get things ready. And so often we find that Jesus has been there before us, preparing the way. There's much less to do than we thought. And finally, our rescue is secure. Our salvation is assured. What a wonderful promise. So have a wonderful day and join us each day as we walk the way of the cross in these last 2 weeks before Easter.